To try to stop the spread of communism, the United States practiced what you call the policy of containment. And that is, let communism exist where it is now, but try to make sure it doesn't take over any place else in the world. Just let's hold it where it is. And folk, this policy of containment was to get us involved in 2 wars, one in Korea and one in Vietnam. But we decided we'd contain them. Now, this takes us up to the blockade. As I've already mentioned, Berlin was located inside the Soviet zone. Well, one day the Soviets just decided we're not going to let the United States and France and Great Britain supply Berlin. We're going to take over the city of Berlin ourselves. So, they put up the Berlin blockade. Harry Truman decided, hey, well, what we're going to do about that, we're just going to send aircraft into Berlin and they'll supply the city of Berlin. So instead of using trucks and trains to supply Berlin, we used airplanes, which was much more expensive. But the Berlin airlift flew day after day into the city of Berlin. And finally, the Soviets agreed to lift the blockade. Now, the Berlin airlift, it's called the Berlin airlift, was the first crisis in the Cold War, and it ended. It's one of the few crises we faced the Soviets where we can say we actually won the crisis. Again, we won it without firing a shot. We just simply, passively flew airplanes in, and the Soviets realized they were not going to be able to starve the city of Berlin, and they finally lifted the blockade because as our trucks were moving through, our truck would stop and buy gasoline and buy supplies from the communist East Germany. So this would help the East German economy, and which would help communism a little bit. So first conflict won by the West, and it was to be very few conflicts after that the West won. Now, to help fight communism, the Allied nations formed a pact that still exists called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It involved the United States and Canada on one side of the Atlantic, Iceland in the middle of the Atlantic, and then nations such as Great Britain, France, Spain, Scandinavia, and even Turkey. Turkey has been a long time member of NATO. These nations, Greece also, these nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which still exists. To counteract NATO, the communist world formed the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw, you may know, is the capital of Poland, but they met at Warsaw and they formed nations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, Yugoslavia, and East Germany. These nations formed together to fight NATO in future war. And NATO and the Warsaw Pact was to be on opposite sides of most issues for the next 45 years. Well, your book names, Bulgaria, Albania, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union, the most obvious one. So Europe was once again divided into hostile camps. Your book then goes into the speculative of who started the Cold War. Again, I'm not going to ask that test, but you can read it. They have some interesting takes on it. That perhaps the West overreacted, that the threat of communism taking over the world was really rather small, that communism, like any other movement, was only going to go so far and not go any farther. Of course, this article was written after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War seemed to be over. Now, folk, when I say the Cold War is over, I say that tongue in cheek. 2 months ago, I thought, sure, the Cold War is over. But in view of events that have happened in Europe in the last couple of months, it looks like the Cold War is being fought again. And round one of the new Cold War seems to have gone to Russia. You may know what I'm talking about. The Russians took over the Crimea and got back with it. And the rest of the world is doing what it always did in the Cold War: sit back, protest, put economic sanctions, write bad letters, make threats, and do little else. The thing about it is the Soviet economy is so bad that you can't hurt it. It's like I once asked my mom, my dad would talk about the Great Depression. I asked my mom, what was the Depression like? She said, well, I hardly knew there was a depression. Why? My mother had grown up in southern Kentucky where they were poor anyway. And when the Depression came, I mean, hey, what's the big deal? We're living like we always did. Poor people can't be hurt by the depression. The Soviet economy, again, I mean, the Russian economy is so bad that economic sanctions won't hurt them. Anyway, the Cold War was to last some 45 years. We'll move away from Europe a little bit to go to the Cold War in Asia. Right after defeating Japan, the two sides in China started fighting again. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. He was a communist, and Chiang he was on our side. I'm going to call him Western. To make a long story short, folks, when it was over and the smoke had cleared, the communists triumphed in China. How can you president? I mean, I count a student president if there's any way in the world that I can. Any reasonable way. All right. Anyway, Mao Zedong won, and the communists took over China in the year 1949. Now, Chiang Kai-shek took 4 million men with him, and they fled to the island of Formosa, sometimes called Taiwan. The island's name is Formosa, but they formed a country called Taiwan. And to this day, jump forward 64 years, the descendants of Chiang Kai-shek's troops are there. Now, most of the people who fled China with Chiang Kai-shek 64 years ago are now deceased. Chiang Kai-shek himself has been long dead. But Taiwan is considered what we call a free country. And the communists took over China and began making changes in China. And to this day, the communists still have taken over. Mao Zedong was eventually replaced by Deng Xiaoping, and eventually replaced, at the moment, does anybody know who the leader of China is right now? And nobody, I don't either. So there's two. Anyway, anyway, this army fled, and they claimed that they are the rightful government of China and should rule China, the government of Taiwan. Now, the United States initially moved in and offered military protection to Taiwan. The Chinese said, one of these days we're going to invade Taiwan. And folks, if the Chinese were to invade Taiwan today, I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what would happen. Would the United States move in and assist, or would the United States just sit back and do nothing? The fact that Taiwan does have an army, but we know that they don't have an army big enough to take on the communists. Anyway, the communists took over in the year 1949, the same year I was born. That's why I can easily remember, yeah, 64 years. Do the math. All right. The takeover was really upsetting the Truman administration, who had tried to say, we're going to try to contain communism. And it explains why the United States then went to war right afterward in Korea. Because once the communists had taken over China, they next moved in to take over Korea, and afterwards moved in to take over Vietnam. We were able to contain them in Korea. Vietnam, we were not able to. But see, the fear we had was if the communists take over Vietnam, they'll take over all of Southeast Asia. Well, guess what, folks? I mean, we're jumping ahead. The communists did take over Vietnam, and nobody else in Southeast Asia embraced communism. We might have been just as well off if we'd let the Vietnamese go, because they were half, 3/4 of them were communistic anyway, or thought they were. All right. The communist government proceeded to recover the territories of Manchuria that they lost to Japan and Taiwan, and well, they did not recover Taiwan, but they recovered Tibet for a while. And as far as Tibet, Tibet has gone back and forth. At times China is controlled, at times not. And we used to have a professor who worked here, had it on his bumper sticker, "Free Tibet," and I'd see that bumper sticker for years. I don't know who the professor was, and I don't know if the car was finally traded in or sold, or if he bought a new one and never did get the bumper sticker. I basically don't know what happened. But Tibet was controlled by a man named the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama would try to get the American presidents to side with him, particularly President Obama, and Obama simply refused to talk to him because he said, we don't want to offend the communist government in China. So Tibet is still under control of the communist government in China. Now, it turned out that we feared that now that China is on the side of the Russians, the communist movement now has 1/3 of the world's population under its control. And I mean, that was a big fear. In other words, if they have 1/3, they might can conquer us. The problem was, and this is a problem that always develops when a movement gets so large, the Chinese and Soviets started fighting among themselves. And I'll say this, folks, and this is something every Islamic person knows. If Islam could have remained united, they would have conquered the world. What happened, it got so big, then they started fighting among themselves. Same way with the communist movement, it got so big, and it started fighting among itself. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in the meantime, we had to fight the Korean War. Now, I believe one of the persons in here did a paper on the Korean War. Yes, it was. Yeah, it was in this class. Anyway, okay. I want to say this much too about your papers, and this applied to both classes. In this semester, more of my pupils have been from abroad than I have had any other semester. And a bunch of you have written papers about your own home country, which I'm not knocking, but I wonder how much of this did you know off the top of your head to begin with, and how much did you have to research? Again, I don't know that. I don't want to argue with you. But I had a Vietnamese boy do a paper on the Vietnam War that was all based on what his father and grandfather had told him, and said, I find this most interesting, but obviously you did not do any research. But it was interesting to me because he was looking on, the United States was that big, monstrous country from abroad who came over here to take away our freedom, and we kept fighting with them until they finally quit fighting. They finally quit them. I mean, I appreciate it. He wound up getting an A in the class, but he laughed out loud when I made a remark that the United States had lost the Vietnam War. Vietnamese communist. But again, those of you who wrote about your own home country, for now that's fine. But anyway, about Korea. The Korean War began in 1950, the year after China had been taken over the communists, when North Korea, with the approval of both Russia and China, invaded South Korea. The United States was terribly upset at having lost in China, and they said, we're not going to lose Korea. So President Harry Truman sent General Douglas MacArthur in to fight off the Koreans. The war was to last about 3 years, from 1950 to 1953, and it seesawed back and forth. At first the communists were winning, then the United States was winning, then the communists started winning again when the Chinese got involved. When China, just about the time the United States had 90% of North Korea conquered, China came in. And they turned the tide, and then the United States eventually fought to a stalemate. Then Eisenhower was elected president, he got a truce signed. Now, the Korean War officially is still going on. No peace treaty was ever signed. All that was signed has been a truce. And that means from time to time North Korea will shoot at South Korea, and from time to time South Korea shoots back. But essentially, there was a war between communists. Now, I want to say this. Unlike Vietnam, the Korean War ended in what you might call a draw, a stalemate, where they divided the country in two, and has remained divided to this day. North Korea got the best of the farmland, and South Korea got the least productive of the farmland. All right, did you hear what I just said? North Korea got the farmland. Guess which side is starving? Anybody know? South Korea got the lousy farmland. Guess which side is starving? No, you've heard it. Anybody else? Excellent. North Korea is starving. I said, well, didn't I just say they got the best of the farmland? Well, South Korea decided to industrialize, and they began copying the Japanese. And they began making cars like the Hyundai and the Kia, which are copies of the Japanese cars. And yeah, who own a Kia know what a little bit about what I'm talking about. Pretty good cars, really. But they industrialized with help from the United States, and even with some help from Japan. And North Korea, they starved. To this day, North Korea is starving, and guess what? They blame all their problems on the United States. And that's a surefire way to guarantee that your problems won't be solved. Blame your problems on someone else. They blame all their problems on the United States. Anyway, South Korea is still divided, but South Korea is prosperous. Their people have done well. I want to say this. I mean, I know this is state school, but the most Christian country on the face of the earth is South Korea. As far as having the highest percentage of people attend church on a given Sunday, it's South Korea. Now, I know South Korea is half Christian and half Buddhist, but still the half who are Christian are very loyal, it seems, to their church and attend regularly. North Korea is officially communistic and atheistic. And like I said, they have not industrialized, they're starving, and they still make news because they're trying to develop a nuclear warhead, still trying to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, and still trying, it seems trying hard to provoke a war that even China doesn't really want.